Echoes of the End is the debut game for Icelandic studio Myrkur. I'm butchering the name. Icelandic names are difficult. Let's just move on. It's a cinematic action-adventure game set after the collapse of a civilization that had mastered the use of the magic crystal wards that dot the landscape. A landscape inspired by Iceland, but this is very much a fantasy setting. Your protagonist is a vestige, one of a handful of people with powers connected to those crystal wards. Magic users, essentially. Your linear adventure begins as a rival nation begins to encroach and disrupt, sending you on a journey of combat, climbing, puzzles, and climbing puzzles. The game had a quiet launch, and I went into it with no particular expectations. Let's get into the review. Echoes of the End gave me a fairly negative first impression, but by the end of it, I was thoroughly impressed. If you'd asked for my opinion 1 hour in, I would have told you that this game was undercooked. The combat felt unrefined and soft, the jumping was weirdly floaty, tech issues were apparent from the very first menus, the characters seemed shallow and badly written. I would have given you a fairly damning verdict. Fast forward 15 hours, with the game complete, and while my opening criticisms haven't entirely melted away, I'm actually impressed by this game. Yes, it's a little bit undercooked in some regards. Sometimes the controls frustrate. The combat does lack a certain snap. But even so, it consistently exceeded my expectations as I progressed through. I actually found the puzzles quite satisfying. The pacing kept me engaged. It kept on delivering new gameplay twists and mechanics throughout. And it just feels like the devs managed to stick to their vision and deliver a quite ambitious adventure in its entirety. No shortcuts, no padding, no compromises. A fully realised game. It's just a little undermined by a lack of polish. The devs are working on patches as we speak, but I suspect that it's going to retain some of those problems, and I can only review what I've actually played. This is an Unreal Engine 5 game, and it leverages signature features of the engine like Lumen and Nanite to deliver crisp, detailed terrain with very natural lighting. It also delivers big on scale. It's a very tight and linear game, but it's pathed in a way that gives you frequent views across the expanses that you've travelled or that you have yet to explore. The opening hour or two don't lay on that much style, but fortunately that is not the case for the entirety of the game. There are some really impressive locations and sites to take in as you go, with a good amount of variety and some particularly striking scenarios that provide more than just a backdrop. They're used to deliver some really cool phases of gameplay. The fantasy setting is based around the volcanic areas of Iceland, and comparisons with Hellblade 2 are simply inevitable. Personally, I wouldn't say that it looks quite as good as Ninja Theory's title, but it also has quite a different emphasis. I introduced it as a cinematic action-adventure, but they're not encroaching on cinema near as heavily as Ninja Theory. The landscapes look great, there's a good variety through the game, characters are really high quality for the cinematics, their faces are a bit more wooden in gameplay, but that's par for the course. And Rin has a really dense, furry cape, just to show off how far graphics have come over the years. The whole visual suite does get betrayed by some Unreal Engine 5 quirks. Most notably, there's flares of coloured light firing off, which I think is Lumen figuring itself out on the fly, but it isn't easily ignored. It's genuinely quite distracting and detrimental to the overall presentation. Cutscenes are sometimes undermined by a broken near-field blur that isn't present in their official trailers, but I couldn't defeat it in the settings menu, so I assume that's a bug. Hopefully it's temporary. Elsewhere there's puddles that don't react to your feet, there's snow that falls indoors, little details that inform a lack of attention to detail, or attention that was just spread a little too thinly in places. Overall though, this game goes big on visuals. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the console versions to see how well they hold up. This whole video is my own gameplay captured on my PC, and I'm not showing the best environments in the game as I don't want to spoil anything, but you can judge for yourself how good it all looks. I think it's quite outstanding, despite the flaws that I've mentioned. The combat in Echoes sticks extremely close to a template that you'll recognise if you play a lot of action-adventure games. Specifically, it's got that control scheme where the right bumper and triggers swing your sword, where the B circle button dodges, and if you were to guess what every other button does from there, you'd likely be exactly right. That's not a bad thing at all. After all, if it ain't broke, just copy it. The main character Rin has a reasonably broad moveset that expands as the game progresses through a light but effective set of skill trees. Her magic is a sort of telekinesis, so she can sling things at enemies, or she can sling enemies at things. She also has a suite of cinematic finishing moves that execute automatically as you fight, and there's a decent variety of grisly murderings to behold that gives the fighting some visual flair. The combat is competent, but it lacks a little weight, a little snap. The parry is a bit inconsistent. All of the heavy strikes have this big wind up without really offering a big payoff, and using the extended 4-hit combos almost always punishes the player with some damage, so much so that I basically didn't use them. Magically tossing enemies around is one of the most fun abilities that a game can offer, but here it does quite frequently lead to enemies getting poised on edges and ledges that they don't know how to navigate, and sometimes results in execution sequences that see Rin viciously stab the air beneath her awkwardly floating adversary. Standard encounters throw between 2 and maybe 6 enemies at a time. It introduces new foes regularly from start to finish, and it does a good job at keeping the encounters fresh in that regard, but it never really challenges you to explore the repertoire of abilities that you have at your fingertips. There are some boss encounters that were enjoyable and all quite distinct from each other, but all of them can be overcome by sticking 2 light attacks in and then dodging whatever's coming back at you, just repeating that cycle. I might sound quite negative on the combat in the game, and I think the critiques are fair, but I didn't feel that the combat particularly hindered the game. The encounters rarely overstayed their welcome. They're well placed and well portioned, and chucking guys off cliffs never really gets old. The whole adventure would be a horrible slog if it was just a fight from start to finish. Fortunately, it's not. Echoes of the End has a fair amount of climbing and a pretty big focus on puzzles. I'm not typically a fan of puzzle games. A puzzle that I can't solve is a source of too much frustration for me to bear. And a puzzle that's abstract gets on my nerves. The puzzles in Echoes of the End are all whatever the opposite of abstract is. They're stract puzzles. Not a word, but you know what I mean. The rules and parameters of the world are clear, the objectives are plain, and they're just challenging enough that you need to think through what you're doing, but not so tough that you'll be tempted to hit YouTube for answers. Not so challenging that they stop the story in its tracks. The game also frequently introduces new types of puzzle with new rules at a good cadence. Nothing groundbreaking, but an assortment of interesting ideas from the smorgasbord of puzzle games that inspired this one. Thinking about it, it's actually quite strange that there's no portal gun. If there is one area of frustration that surfaces in the puzzles, it has to be the climbing. The game does feature a lot of netting, a lot of climbable surfaces, sometimes for simple traversal and sometimes as part of the puzzling. And you're certain to fall to your death more than once when you had the right idea but you lost a fight with the controls. The game features quite a small cast of central characters that by and large deliver their lines very well. It does not put its best foot forwards, as the protagonist's brother Core that you meet in the opening sequences isn't particularly well written or well realised, but overall the cast deliver well and the story, while quite predictable and entirely fixed in place, flows really nicely. The mix of cinematics, exposition, combat and puzzling is well crafted, and it all moves along nicely right through to the conclusion of the game. It's all backed by a musical score that fits really well and elevates the big moments. I played this game at launch, and that's regrettable in a sense, as there are parts that I'm sure are going to improve. There's already been some patches and the devs have acknowledged some of the other issues that I've had, but I can only review what I've played. HDR is currently completely broken, and it isn't the only option in the settings menus that you just can't toggle. Even when the HDR toggle is enabled, I don't expect a drastic difference in the visuals of the game. I don't think it's been authored or color graded for it, and so the toggle itself isn't really a big deal, but a broken settings menu before even hitting the title screen just isn't a great first impression. Unreal Engine hitching was heavy towards the start of the game and present throughout. I also had a couple of hard crashes, and at one point about 12 hours in, I thought I may have to abandon the game entirely, as the game crashed 3 times on the bounce trying to enter a new area. 4th time was the charm, and I obviously got to the end of the game, but it was a bit disconcerting. I already mentioned flares of colour, bold greens and reds that streak up uninvited, and the broken depth of field effect in the cutscenes. Those are all things that I think are likely to improve if you wait a month or 2 to play the game, so long as the devs are able to knuckle down and keep on the project. With that said, I don't think anyone will ever play this game without encountering minor issues. awkward postures for the main characters and enemies as they struggle with ledges, dying when the controls let you down, either in combat or in climbing, and other little flaws that I've mentioned through the review are likely to persist. But so will all the good things that I've praised, the many elements that the game gets right, the puzzles, the pacing, the surprisingly expansive journey, that's all here to stay. It took me about 15 hours to get through the campaign on the default balanced difficulty. It's a very tight and linear experience. There are a few inconsequential dialogue choices, and there are treasure chests and collectibles to seek out along the path, but really very little to warrant playing it beyond that first 15 hours. I don't typically mention price when I'm talking about the value of a game in a review, as the price is obviously going to change over time. I just try to tell you what you're getting in the package. But I will say that I was quite shocked that I was able to pick this game up for 23 quid on the day that it came out. I don't think I want to do review scores actually, but as I haven't quite settled on that, I'll throw one out here. Echoes of the End aims surprisingly high in its adventure, with good tech and lots of talent involved. It's also a very tight, very linear game, and I could say that it's reasonably long, but not particularly girthy. I'd only be saying that to make Tom and Tony giggle though, and Pete. I reckon Pete would find that funny. I also think that it's fair to say that every element of this game is derivative of other games. It's not innovative in anything that it does. I'll give it a B for scope. It's definitely an ambitious start for a new studio. In terms of execution, you've got good performances, excellent pacing, well thought puzzles and beautiful environments, playing off against some tech issues and a lack of polish around some important areas of gameplay that run through the entirety of the experience. I'm going to be handing this a 70 for execution. Overall, I've come away from this game impressed. Yes, it's derivative, but it's derivative of things that I really like, and the sum of its parts was a game that I'm glad that I've played. That is it for this review, so thank you for sticking with it. If you have played Echoes of the End, let me know what you agreed with, what you disagreed with. Basically give me a review of my review. See you next time.